Welcome back to another Bill of Rights Institute primary source close read. This is part 2 of checking out Federalist 10, one of the 85 Federalist papers written between August of 1787 and August of 1788, when the Federalists were arguing in favor of ratification of the new Constitution. So in the part 1, we looked at what were the causes of factions, why is it that they're a part of popular governments, and what does it mean that they are sown, as Publius says, sown in the nature of man. And in part 2, we're going to take a look at what Publius' solution is to that problem, or what he argues that the Constitution does to try to fix those problems that factions cause. So let's check it out. So now we're back in Federalist 10, and we're going to look at what it is that Publius says the Constitution, the new Constitution, does to ameliorate or get rid of this problem of faction, or if not get rid of it, in his words, control its effects. So how are we going to control the effects of faction? So what is it that this new Constitution does? Again, keeping in mind that this new Constitution is being put forward as a replacement for the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation had gotten the United States through the American Revolution, but it was starting to sort of the challenges were arising, not least which brought about by different factions that had interests, in particular different states that were competing with other states. This new Constitution is hoping to come forward and deal with some of those issues. And there are concerns about that because this new Constitution represents a much greater centralization of power at the national level than did the Articles of Confederation. So one of the concerns is whether or not that centralization of power is going to threaten the rights of individuals within the states. And so Publius says this: to secure the public good and private rights against the dangers of such a faction, and at the same time preserve the spirit and form of popular government, is then the great object which our inquiries are directed, to which our inquiries are directed. In other words, protecting the public good and the private rights of individuals are what we need to do in a government. Sometimes that public good and those private rights are in tension with one another. They're not always aligned. We just talked about that in part 1, where we were looking at different interests and things that are represented by individuals. Here, Publius is acknowledging that, but also saying doing both of those things is why it is that we need to have a government in the first place, and ensuring that a single faction, say at the time it may have been that the large states were going to get rid of or trample over the interests of the small states. We need to prevent that from happening, to promote the good for all and to protect the private rights of all these individuals. He goes on to use these two big words. He says, let me add that the desideratum by which alone this form of government can be rescued from the long opprobrium under which it has long labored, and be recommended to the esteem and adoption of mankind. So he's saying that this is the great problem that all popular governments have suffered under, and it is absolutely necessary, if we're going to recommend a new form of popular government to function, that we need to solve this problem of factions. We need to solve this problem that has often come up and sort of torn things apart. So I've included here an image of the Senate from 1855. And this is Henry Clay standing in front of the Senate giving his famous oration. Henry Clay is known as the Great Compromiser because of his role in both the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850 and other pieces of legislation. The idea being that, look, particularly during that time in sort of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, leading up to the Civil War, there was this big question about how is it that we can work together to work towards national goals. Sometimes that has pitfalls, that has shown to be challenging. But what Publius is arguing for is, look, in this new national government, we'll be able to create something that allows for that kind of compromise to be put forward. Whether or not it's a good compromise or a bad compromise is a conversation for another day. But what Publius is saying is this new Constitution will allow us to have individuals, politicians elected that will help us to work towards coming to solutions that will serve the common good of the greater part of the nation. Hopefully, that's the argument. So Publius goes on to say this: how do we do that? How does this Constitution do that? If that's the goal, trying to promote the public good and protect these private rights, how is it that we're going to go about trying to make that happen? And he says, evidently by one or two only. So how is this obtainable? Either the existence of the same passions or interests in a majority at the same time, so we get everybody around and focused on something at the same time, or the majority having such a coexistent passion or interest must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. In other words, we have to prevent them from coming to have the same opinions, or we have to somehow control by the number of people that are involved, there's become so many people involved, they can't come to this single scheme of oppression that's going to trammel on the rights of other people. He says, from this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. In other words, a pure democracy isn't going to be able to control for these things, right? Because in a pure democracy, you're going to have a small group of people who are directly voting on their own interests. They themselves have their own interests represented, and they are speaking on behalf of everybody else. What that results in, and they would argue this from sort of looking at ancient history and looking at different examples of democracies that come up, whether it was the Athenians or others, they're saying that passion always rules in a democracy. When you get a group of people together, their passions are going to be the thing that comes forward. So that's not a solution. So what is a solution? A republic, by which, here Publius again defining what he means by a republic, he means a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect, and promises the cure for which we are seeking. So pure democracy is all the individuals voting for themselves, but in a republic, you have this scheme of representation, meaning that you have individuals voting for other individuals to represent their interests. Well, how is that a solution to what we're talking about? So he says, again, I've got the definition of here of what he means by a republic, but he says that what this does is it refines and enlarges public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. He says it refines and enlarges the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. So what do we mean here? He means that by having individuals who elect other individuals, you essentially have now a single individual representing multiple views. And so then that relies on their wisdom to discern the true interest of their country, right? So I have interests, my colleagues at the Bill of Rights Institute may have interests. When we vote for an individual, what results from that is that I now, as the representative, am possessing all of these things, and I have to use my wisdom to then determine what is going to be the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And the hope is that their love of patriotism and their love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. In other words, I now have this big interest that I'm trying to represent all of these different individuals. I'm going to use my own wisdom, guided by justice and my love of my country, to try to make the best decision possible. Now, is that idealistic? Maybe Publius here is looking sort of like, again, for that statesman, which he said won't always be in control. But what he's saying here is that the hope is that this will take place. And in another part of the paper, which I haven't included, he even says, look, there's limits to what this can do. But the idea is, if we can try to get these people in place and we're sort of filtering these views through, we've got a greater opportunity. He says the question resulting then, if we think Republicans can solve this problem, which most did, there was arguments in the Federalist Papers about whether or not the new Constitution represents a republic. They've made that case, saying yes, it does represent a republic. Most were in agreement that republics do this. Here he's appealing sort of to the people who want a Republican form of government. He says the question resulting is whether or not small or expensive republics are most favorable to the election of proper guardians of the public weal, and it is clearly decided in favor of the latter. So are states or is the national government going to be better at doing this, or a stronger national government? The public weal, all he's meaning here by public weal is the public good, right? What is best for the most amount of people? And he says, clearly, it's going to be where the most amount of people involved, this extended republic. So we're talking about, we've refined our views, and now if we've refined those views, what is going to be better for refining those views? Is it a small, concentrated number of people in a small republic, or is it going to be larger? Because there's many questions that have been raised about whether or not you could have this sort of large, what Publius calls an extended republic. It's part of the new constitutional scheme. So he says it's this big one. So how do we know? What's his argument for saying this? He says clearly. Let's see what he means by clearly. So again, the question resulting is this: extensive republics are more favorable to the election of proper governance of public weal, and it is clearly decided in favor of the latter by two obvious considerations. What are those considerations? He says, look, that if the proportion of fit characters be not less in large than in small, he says that consequently, we've got a greater probability, right? In other words, there's just more people in an extended republic. Great. If you've got more people, the odds of us choosing someone that's going to be good are greater. That's positive. He also says each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens. And it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts, right? So when you got a bunch of people, it's a lot harder to convince a bunch of people of something that's bad than it is to convince one or two people. So bigger republic, we've got more odds that we're going to find somebody that's good, and we've got more people represented, meaning that more people can hold these elected officials accountable and keep them from practicing these vicious arts, right? These are going to be arts of deception, or they're going to be trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. So the idea is, look, we get a bunch of people, they vote for these representatives. The more people that are voting, the more odds that we're going to hold them accountable, and the better it's going to be. So this is, again, in favor of this new national constitution, saying extend the republic, get more people involved, get more interests involved. That is how you're going to control the effects of faction. So he goes on to say, hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy, meaning everybody agrees. His audience in New York at this time would have said, look, yeah, if republic's better than democracy, saying here again, that can control factions. So too, a large instead of a small republic is going to be best for controlling these things. So the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but it will be unable to spread a general conflagration among the states. And the extent and proper structure of the union, therefore, we behold a republic remedy for the diseases most incident to the Republican government, and according to the degree of pleasure and pride we feel in being Republicans ought to be our zeal in cherishing the spirit and supporting the character of Federalists. Federalists being those individuals who are in favor of this new national constitution. Now, this is interesting because Publius here is saying, look, this is we're trying to tilt things in this favor. We're trying to make sure that this new constitution that we're establishing is going to keep this from happening. And he's saying, look, at the time, it's going to be hard for all these different state interests to come together. Now, we know, being students of history, that in the 1860s, this is actually what happens. There is a faction of states who are united by an interest around enslavement of individuals that come together and do this. And it does turn out to be something that that challenges the very fabric of the Union. And it's something that Abraham Lincoln is very attuned to, trying to put aside this idea of faction. In the lead up to the Civil War, there's many attempts at compromise and trying to sort this out. So we see this play out. And again, I would caution anyone to think that Publius is putting forward the absolute perfect solution here. But what he is arguing and saying, if we're going to control factions, this is the best way to do it. This new constitutional system is going to put us in a position where this is controlled as much as possible in popular government. Because again, thinking back to part one, factions are going to arise. He's not trying to get rid of them. But what he is saying is if they're going to be there, this is the best way to control them. So back to our big question, how does the structure of the federal system promote the common good? Well, in a number of ways. So again, back to our big question, how is it that the structure of our federal system, how does it promote the common good? In a number of ways. Publius says, look, faction is inherent in popular governments. Human beings, if you're going to have a popular government, meaning people are going to share their opinions and their views, factions are going to result. So what do? Well, we can't remove the causes, because removing the causes would be stamping out liberty and trying to give everybody the same opinions. It's not going to happen. But what we can do is try to control its effects. Are we going to do that perfectly all the time? No, but the idea would be that this new constitution is going to help that happen. So how does it control the effects? Well, we've got a Republican form of government. We're passing through our individual interests to people who are representing a broad set of all these interests, relying on their wisdom to be able to have conversations and discuss with other representatives about what the best possible solution is for the most amount of people is going to be. So that's we're entrusting those public guardians to represent our interests and to work through wisdom, keeping in mind justice and their patriotism and the love of country in order to find those good solutions that are going to be best for most. And then that's going to be even better. So a Republican government is good, but when you extend that republic and so you cover even more interests, that's going to be even better. So we have this filtering of ideas, then we have this extending of the republic. And those are two things that are key to sort of Publius's arguments for why this new constitution is going to function. And ultimately, it comes down to us as the people. And throughout this, Publius points to important things that it's ultimately the people who are the guarantors of this succeeding. Sometimes this can be seen as sort of a mechanistic thing, right? Like we've got this perfect structure and now all of a sudden it's going to be perfect. But again, thinking about what happens in the Civil War, that's a failure of public officials, that their inability to come and get rid of enslavement and come to a national consensus to get rid of that evil in the country led to factions, led to different economic interests that could not come to a final a conclusion, a compromise that would have brought that about. And so the country was rendered apart because they failed to do that. So that's a failure of the individuals, keeping in mind that it's within the system. So the system needs the people need the system. Together they work to try to promote the public good and promote the public weal. So thank you all so much for joining me for both these parts of explaining Federalist 10. I hope you learned something, and I hope that you'll join us next time. If you have any topics or things that you want to see us explore, please reach out to us on Facebook or on Twitter, or feel free to email the Bill of Rights Institute. We're always looking for new ideas, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.